Hello everyone and welcome to lecture number 2 in chapter 3. So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the three branches of government and kind of the basics of each of those branches. We're not going to go into too much detail just for the fact that we are going to really, the majority of the rest of this course, the second half of it, is solely going to be organized around the three branches. So we'll look at each of those separately and kind of spend our own unit time on each of the branches. So we'll just kind of go over the basic principles here. What's nice about it is it builds and gives you guys not only understanding of what they're supposed to do and reaffirms like stuff that you know that they do, but it will work as this stuff will all work as information that can help you in the latter part of the course, like I was saying in the last section. So this is stuff that we're going to be using throughout really the rest of this course. So very, very important here, and we're going to see a lot of these principles moving forward. So let's get started. All right. So, whoops, computer lag there a little bit. We're going to start with Article 1. We'll start with the legislative branch, then move on to the executive, and then the judicial in order. So basically, you have different powers that are laid out in the Constitution that say, okay, this is what the legislative branch is supposed to do. And they do that for all the branches, as you guys have seen, and we'll see going forward. The express powers are the ones that are directly stated in the Constitution. If you were to read the Constitution, or I was saying, all right, guys, your homework tonight is I want you to read Article 1, and I want you to write down, just list them, every single power that is specifically stated that's given to our legislative branch, and you wrote them down, these would be the express powers. Now, an example of those, and this is where some people can get a little confused just because you're using two different terms here, is the enumerated powers. The enumerated powers, there are 18 of them that are given in Section 8 of Article 1. Now, these are all express powers, but there are more powers that are stated in other parts of Article 1 as well. So express powers are everything stated in the Constitution specifically for the branches of government. The enumerated powers is an example of these for our legislative branch, but not the only ones that our legislative branch has. So these 18, they're enumerated. They're called that because they're actually numbered. There are 5 economic powers and 7 defense, and then we'll talk about the remainder on the next slide. But basically, Congress has the ability to levy taxes, so collect taxes, raise them and collect taxes. They have the ability to borrow money at varying levels with different groups. They can regulate commerce or trade. They could coin money, which means to print money, and they can punish counterfeiting. Now, it's if we were in class, or if you guys were in class hearing this, this is where we'd actually take a look at in terms of various forms of money. If you're at home, I would take 5 minutes, just search up different ways that whether it's the United States or other countries actually work to kind of prevent counterfeiting from happening in the currency. It's actually pretty interesting in terms of what they do with their bills. And you'll actually see different forms of money. And you'll see that the United States currency is very, very different than a lot of the other currencies out there. Both good and bad, and I just mean from an aesthetic standpoint. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. If you take just 5 minutes, look at the ways that governments try to prevent counterfeiting in their currency. It's pretty cool. All right. As for defense powers, there are 7 of them. Like I said, they can punish piracy or pirates. They can declare. Congress declares war. Okay, you need to understand this. This is something that's a lot of people think because the president is the commander in chief that they can declare war. They actually can't. It's Congress that does, and this is an example of separation of powers and checks and balances. And then the other things that they can do is they can regulate, raise, and support armed forces, as well as call or organize militia. So those other 5 powers are really about just raising and regulating military forces. All right. Now, as for the other enumerated powers, you can see them on the screen. Congress has the ability to naturalize citizens. This is a very, very important power considering where we came from as a nation, where we started. Okay, America's unique melting pot of individuals coming from all over the world And that's how we started. And that they had to put in a process to have people that were coming from other countries to become citizens of the United States. And that's the example of that. Or this is how they do that. The next one is Congress actually has the ability to establish post offices, courts, and then they can deal with patents and copyrights. And the reason why that's established as well, specifically patents and copyrights in post office, is because of these powers here: taxes, borrowing of money, regulating commerce, really. And then Congress also has the power to govern DC, because DC is not its own state. It has its own like local government in terms of mayor and stuff like that. But it's a district. Congress has powers to govern that. And then the most important enumerated clause or enumerated power is the elastic clause, or you might hear it called the necessary and proper clause. And I want you guys to look at that picture of the slinky and take a second and say, okay, the slinky moves back and forth if you put it in your hands, or you drop it down the stairs like you're supposed to, and see how it moves. And the idea of this is that this clause, this elastic clause, it gives Congress the flexibility to carry out its powers and make all laws that are, in the words of the Constitution, necessary and proper for them to carry out all of their other powers in Article 1. So basically what this elastic clause does is it gives Congress the flexibility to do what it needs to do if something wasn't specifically stated in the previously mentioned enumerated powers, as well as other express powers that aren't part of the enumerated powers, if that makes sense. If you guys take a second and just click on that link for elastic, it's just a funny little video dealing with the slinky from Ace Ventura 2. Has nothing really to do with the course. It's just to give you guys a nice little laugh. All right. So Congress, then in terms of when we established it versus now, we're going to go over a little bit of history here, just in some basics. So Congress actually originally was placed in New York, and then it moved to Philadelphia. And what they did is how they had it separated is we had the bicameral legislature, so two houses. The House being bigger met downstairs, the Senate being smaller met upstairs. And they determined electoral votes in the presidential election through the House of Representatives plus a quorum by the Senate. So they would have 12 members from the Senate hold a joint vote with the House of Representatives in the first electoral votes for president. Now, in our first two presidential elections, it was pretty straightforward. Everybody voted for Washington as the first president, and then John Adams is the second option. And under the rules at that point, whoever came in second place would become the VP. So John Adams was George Washington's vice president. It's the only time in history that we've had a unanimous decision in terms of who was going to be president. I don't think we're going to have that anytime soon. We're definitely not going to have it in 2020 or 2024 or really ever again. But that had a lot to do with in terms of the founding of the country and the role that George Washington played in that. Now, by 1795, as in the first few years, Congress was figuring its way out. Eventually, they realized they had to form various committees so that they could kind of help split up the work or ideas and laws that were being proposed in Congress, even though there are very few bills that are being proposed at the time. And you got to think of it too, our government was trying to figure its way through at this point. So there isn't necessarily all this stuff going on. Plus, we're a much smaller country and things aren't going to be moving as fast because of technology, because of the fact that we're smaller, and because we're brand new as a government. So it was a very different job then than it is now. In reality, actually, we think of congressmen and women today as that's a full-time job, and it is. But that really wasn't the case until really right around World War II, in some areas previously before that, and some just after. And that was mainly because of the size of government, because of really technology in terms of transportation. Because think about it now, it's really easy to be able to communicate, whether you're in the office in DC or back in your home district or home state. Well, back, 50, 60, 70 years ago, it would take a little bit in terms of transporting yourself from one place to the other. Specifically, let's say you were in California, had to get to DC. It was hard to have it as a full-time job. Now, going back even further at the beginning, if congressmen weren't there, then Congress really couldn't necessarily meet unless it has a specific number of people. We'll get into that later in terms of those ideals when we get into chapters 5 and 6, talking specifically about the legislative branch. All right, now we're going to move on to the president here, the executive powers. And there's several video clips here. They all are examples or news stories that talk about these specific powers. And if you're in class, we'll watch these. If you're at home, please take some time to look at these. They're very informative and can give you guys examples of these powers in use. Now, the president specifically has vague powers, and the vague powers are laid out to give him or her an interpretation power. So they can determine what they need to do based on these. And the examples are firing of officials, entering into foreign agreements with other countries, and emergency actions. And the reason why these are vague is because think about it. Look at the first one. Okay, the first one's obvious. If you need to fire an official, then you're the boss. You should be able to do so. Now that depends on the official, obviously, but like say somebody's working for you in your White House office. We've seen this specifically with Trump quite often. He's fired many officials in his presidency, and he can do that. Now, the president can't go fire a senator or a representative, but if somebody that's working on their cabinet or working within the White House office, they can do so. And the reason why that is because it's open. It has to be open to interpretation. You don't want to call in the other branch of government every time that happens, because that's not always needed. Obviously, if you have a bad employee, you can get rid of them. Entering into foreign agreements. This is vague and open to interpretation for a variety of reasons, but just think about it in terms of what's going on in the world, what needs to happen. Foreign agreements can be open to interpretation. That doesn't mean that the other branches aren't called in or the president doesn't bring in other people to talk about it. It just means that there is a little bit of leeway there. And if there needs to be a formal agreement put together, this is laid out within the specific powers, and there's checks and balances within that. And then the president determining emergency actions. This has been something that's been a really big thing, really all across this country right now, because these powers translate themselves to also governors. And we're seeing a lot of people push back or be controversial in terms of executives using their emergency powers, with President Trump specifically first being the issue of the migrant caravan and the border wall with the funding and all that kind of stuff, or like even during this COVID coronavirus pandemic, people pushing back against emergency actions by the president, or like our governor here, Governor Whitmer, people pushing back and not necessarily agreeing with how they're using their emergency actions, whether they're doing it correctly or not. There's been a lot of controversy over that, but they're open to interpretation. All right. In terms of specific powers, the president is the commander-in-chief. They're the head of the United States military. Okay. They can't declare war, as we talked about previously, but they are the head of the military. They also appoint department heads. So this actually kind of goes with the firing of officials too. So when we'll just use President Trump because he's our most recent current president. So when he came into office in 2017, but was elected in 2016, he had to put together committees and to try to find, or groups to try to find officials for his cabinet. And they went through and he appointed them. Now, some have been fired, some have stepped down, and he's had to appoint other ones, but that's an example. The president can also pardon or reduce sentences or fines. This has been a big thing throughout really a lot of presidencies, at least recently, with our current president, or if you go back and look at FDR or Bill Clinton. Typically, though, you usually see presidents reduce sentences or pardon sentences, or use pardon at the end of their terms, so they don't face a lot of backlash. President Trump has used this pardoning tool quite a bit, most notably in Roger Stone just a few weeks ago. That was met with some controversy and so forth. But again, it's his right to do so. It's a specific power laid out in the Constitution. Number 4, they have the power to make treaties with other countries. Here you can see Obama and the president of Russia, Medvedev, at the time making a treaty. So this is quite a few years ago. They can appoint judges and officials. So the president is the one that actually appoints judges to the Supreme Court, and then a check to balance the powers there on that is that it has to be confirmed by the Senate. The president will give an annual State of the Union address, which is exactly what it is. It's a State of the Union, and then lays out how everything was and then where they want to go. So when President Trump comes out and gives his State of the Union, he'll talk about usually the past year or how programs are going, and then he'll really lay out where he wants to go. Like in the next year, what he hopes to accomplish is generally what the State of the Union address is for. 7 is it calls Congress. They can call Congress into session. This is a big one, more specifically in the earlier stages of our government's history because of the lack of Congress being a full-time job. Now that it is, this doesn't necessarily need to be called upon as much, but it does and is used at times. Number 8 is meeting with heads of states, foreign officials, ambassadors. He's an executive, the president's executive. They have to meet with other heads of states and foreign ambassadors. President also commissions military officers. And then 10, their job is to faithfully execute laws, okay, and make sure that they're faithfully executed, not just by him or her, but by others. So the presidency then and now is really the biggest difference. In 1789, when it was created, the presidency was a novel idea. And what that means is it was basically brand new. It wasn't something that had been really used in history before. We technically had a president under the Articles of Confederation, but it wasn't really a president. So that's really kind of only the first example. But George Washington was our first president, and he was very cautious. And there was really a number of reasons. He's a very interesting figure to go back and look at. But he was cautious because, one, he didn't want to become this overpowerful ruler like a king, but he also understood, and this is the greatness of George Washington. If you go back and look at it, he was good as president, but he did some things you're like, well, that's not necessarily the best. But the greatness of George Washington was in his ability to understand, look, I'm the first president. What I do is going to set a precedent for all the future presidents to do. So when he was doing what he was doing as president, he was very careful. Now, part of the things that actually helped him was that there was very little to do at times for him because things worked so slow. We were a smaller country. We were just trying to figure out a way, whatever you want to talk about there. It could be there were times where he had very little to do. And he served 2 terms, so that was enough. And we've only had one president that has served more than 2. And we will only have one president that has served more than 2 unless they change those rules in the Constitution with another amendment. But how he operated as president is a complete difference from how our president now operates. Okay, today the president's life is planned completely down to the minute in most cases. Now you might have presidents that slip away, and like in the case of President Trump or really Obama and Bush. Can't remember if Clinton did this a lot as well in terms of this activity, but they escape away and play golf. And they're humans; they're allowed to do that. But it's a very stressful, demanding job, and you have to think about what are some things that the president has to deal with now that like George Washington didn't have to deal with. Specifically the threat of nuclear warfare is a big one. Global trade. Yes, Washington had to deal with that, but it wasn't necessarily, obviously not on the same scale and the number of issues and ideas and stuff that you have to deal with as they do now. But it's a very demanding job and it's completely different than what it was originally. All right, so the judicial branch here, we're almost done. The judicial branch, you have Supreme Court justices. They serve life terms. So basically that means they either serve until they step down, commit a federal crime, or they pass away. And there are two systems in terms of how our judicial branch is broken up. You have federal courts in terms of jurisdictions, two systems of jurisdiction, sorry. You have federal courts and you have state courts. And then the local courts fit within the state court parameter. So federal courts derive their power from the Constitution and federal law. State courts derive their power from state laws and state constitutions. And if there's ever a conflict between the two, the federal courts will win out because they have the supremacy that's established in the Supremacy Clause. So the factors that go into where cases should go are subject matter and what parties are involved. And this could mean if there's various states, people from different states, people from a local area, whoever you're looking at, this is going to determine if it's going to go to the state level or federal level as well as the subject matter. So you have to think about in terms of what cases would be tried in federal courts. If a state is suing another state, that goes to the federal court. If you have somebody that's brought up on charges of robbery that committed a crime here in the state of Michigan and only Michigan, it would be a state matter. If you have somebody that kidnaps somebody, crosses the border of a state, depending on what actions are actually done within that and so forth, generally if you're passing state lines, it will become a federal matter. So it just depends on what cases are what those two factors are. And again, I'm speaking in general terms. If you're looking at specifics, it can change. So the Supreme Court is really kind of is a very important branch of our judicial branch is a very important branch of our government, but it has been organized and developed more slowly than the other two. And really, it took over 100 years, almost 120 years for our government to really establish the modern court system that we have today, and put it in a process, put it in use. One of the weirdest things that I thought in terms of as I was learning about government and stuff when I was your age was that the Supreme Court actually didn't get its own individual building until 1935. When Congress had the Capitol building and the president had the White House and so forth for many years before that, many decades. And I just think it was kind of odd that they didn't have their own. And the reason why is there's a variety of reasons, but what they would do before is they would, what was called riding the circuit. They would travel to each of the federal districts to try cases. Now, judicial review, like I said, very, very important. We talked about this earlier in the last lecture. It allows for great power within our judicial branch. And it's all about remembering what judicial review means, everybody. It's the ability to rule something if it is constitutional or unconstitutional. Do not forget that. Now, this last bullet point here is very important as well. Supreme Court can only be overturned by an amendment or a ruling in itself. Okay, so the Supreme Court, when they make a decision and it is passed, their decision can only be overturned by another ruling that they make. So, for example, Plessy versus Ferguson established separate but equal. They made a ruling in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education that overturned that. Or a constitutional amendment can come in and say, look, this can't be done. Okay, or we're going to change it. All right, so just a couple slides here real quick. There's shared power and conflict because of the separation of powers and checks and balances. The president has many different faces. The president, even though they're in the executive branch, often does work as a legislator because they have an agenda that they want to get done when they come into office. Like if you listen to them and what they're trying to do in the State of the Union address or their campaigns before the elections, that's generally what their agenda or what they're going to try to do. How are they going to get that done? They have to work closely with Congress to have that policy to work. And this is where conflict can kind of arise. The biggest one is political. And this is probably our biggest issue today in government, whether it's between the president and Congress or the different houses of Congress, is that the parties aren't working together very well. And you see the problems on both sides, it's not one-sided, but that is a big issue. So like if the president has if the president's political party has control of both houses of Congress, generally you're going to see them work better together. If those are split or fully split, like let's say in the example, because President Trump's a Republican and Congress is fully controlled by the Democrats, because of the issues today between the divisions of political parties, he's probably not going to be able to get much done. And then even if, like what it's right now, where you have one political party controlling one house and the other controlling the other, that's a big pushback too. But it's not just about political parties. It's also about in terms of the power itself. So as the presidential powers has expanded, so has Congress's. So that expansion had led them to come into conflict with each other, whether it's like I was talking about in the previous lecture with FDR or President Trump, because they were active presidents. They're not always right about doing this, but they're not always wrong either. You can see that kind of conflict come in together because those are the two biggest ones in terms of they're the two biggest branches in terms of determining policy and how our government interacts and what it does. Okay, now Congress versus the courts. Congress has the power to create lower courts, and they're reluctant to do so because of the court system, the judicial branch. So they do this very rarely, but it's pretty much just because they have other things they need to do. And then really our judicial branch is organized pretty well, so they don't necessarily have to do this, and that's why they're also reluctant to. Now the president versus the Supreme Court, sometimes the relationship isn't necessarily the best, and sometimes it's great. And it's primarily because when you look at issues between the Supreme Court and the president, usually when they develop is because the Supreme Court, even though they pass a law, doesn't mean that law is going to be complied with. And they're going to need somebody to enforce that. And they need generally presidential compliance. And if that's not happening, then that might mean that there's conflict between the two branches. It might mean that a law isn't necessarily going to be enforced. And we saw this a few years ago when same-sex marriage was applied. You had some people that were in local areas pushing back against same-sex marriage and not allowing it to happen. Well, the president reinforced that, and then law enforcement in those areas actually enforced that ruling as well. So the Supreme Court needs others to help enforce them, and that can lead to issues. All right, guys, sorry I kind of rambled a little bit here and talked a little bit more about certain subjects. Please make sure you guys review this. And like I said, we'll talk more about the specifics of each branch of government in their respective units as we go forward. Have a good one.